Confederate monuments are coming down one by one, but many of the tributes to those on the losing side of the Civil War are a lot newer than you might probably think.
Well, Dan Bowen shows us the toppling of these statues is revealing the truth about the Confederacy and our nation's history.
It's about the unfinished business of progress. Part of a national reckoning on racial injustice.
Black power.
Confederate monuments and statues across the country torn down.
This is great. This feels great. It's a people's victory.
A movement for change, unmasking a toxic myth in American history.
The George Floyd protests, or what I like to refer to as the 2020 uprisings, have been the tipping point.
Cabria Bumgarner is a professor at the University of New Hampshire. She says to appreciate what's happening now, it's important to understand when and why these Confederate symbols were created in the first place.
This period that we refer to as the Jim Crow era, so the 1890s to the 1950s.
The graph from the Southern Poverty Law Center laying it out. Spikes in the creation of statues and monuments coinciding with important moments in the racial history of the United States. The first in the early 1900s as states create Jim Crow laws disenfranchising African Americans. And then another wave of Confederate symbols in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement.
And the monuments were really built to, I think, assert white supremacy. To traffic in the idea of the lost cause.
The lost cause of the Confederacy, a century-old effort to hide the truth about what happened during the Civil War, that the Confederacy was on the wrong side of humanity.
A lot of effort to sort of reimagine the Civil War, reimagine the Confederate struggle in the Civil War as a noble struggle to defend the white race.
Matt Karp is a historian at Princeton, where the university recently removed former President Woodrow Wilson's name from its public and international affairs school. The 28th president, deemed a racist, his administration in the early 1900s segregated the federal workforce, setting back African Americans for a generation, while also naming 10 military institutions after Confederate officers.
Celebrations of the Confederacy in this period were explicit about the Confederacy, the Confederate project as being a project to defend the white race and the purity of the white race and so on. And ideologically, these things they really went hand in hand. You put up a Confederate monument and you pass Jim Crow legislation. The same people were involved, and the same leaders and the same fundraisers and the same sort of prominent local officials.
Though dozens have come down in the last few years, hundreds of Confederate reminders remain in this country. Tokens also including schools, government buildings, and roads, and outside courthouses in just about every county in the South, says Civil War historian Sarah Beetham.
That is really significant because that is the place that is really the center of government for the entire county.
Now, groups like National Trust for Historic Preservation are rethinking the monuments and their historical purpose, supporting complete removal of these symbols for the first time.
In many ways, these monuments, many of them, promote a false narrative of history. And so in that sense, they're not promoting history themselves.
And in New York, Mayor de Blasio wants the federal government to change the name of a road named after Robert E. Lee at the Army base in Brooklyn, while sculptures to Confederate generals have already come down at Bronx Community College, same with a tree plaque at a Brooklyn church.
Our history as the greatest nation in the world will not be tampered with.
But the Pentagon has moved to ban Confederate flags at its institutions, though the White House is still resisting calls to rename those 10 military bases.
These monumental and very powerful bases have become part of a great American heritage and a history of winning, victory, and freedom.
But demonstrators have also started tearing down other historical figures they associate with oppression, like Christopher Columbus, leading President Trump to label it all vandalism and anarchy, while explaining his defense for displays of Confederate symbols.
When people proudly had their Confederate flags, they're not talking about racism. They love their flag. It represents the South.
A nation almost severed by civil war nearly 160 years ago at what now feels like another breaking point. The volatility perhaps most poignant this 4th of July, when a group of heavily armed, mostly black men marched through Stone Mountain Park just outside of Atlanta.
Black love, black love.
It's the location of the largest Confederate monument in the country, featuring the rebel president and 2 generals.
Confederate monuments were built during the Jim Crow era of racial segregation as a way to assert white supremacy and the myth of the lost cause. How powerful and meaningful would it be if we built new monuments that stand for racial justice, that stand for Black freedom, that stands for civil rights?
Dan Bowens, Fox 5 News.
History